Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished her morning workout in the military base gym. The desert heat of Camp Leatherneck was already unbearable at 0700 hours, and she knew it would only get worse as the day progressed. She had been stationed at this remote outpost in Afghanistan for 3 months now, officially listed as a communications specialist with the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. What nobody knew, except for a select few with the highest security clearances, was that Sarah's real mission was far more complex and dangerous than managing radio equipment and satellite communications. She was part of an elite covert operations team that reported directly to Naval Special Warfare Command. Her cover identity as a regular Marine communications specialist was carefully crafted to allow her to move freely around the base and gather intelligence without raising suspicion. The base was a melting pot of military personnel from different branches and countries. Marines, Army soldiers, Navy personnel, Air Force pilots, and various international coalition forces all shared the same dusty compound in the middle of nowhere. With over 8,000 personnel crammed into a space designed for half that number, tensions often ran high. The combination of extreme heat, isolation, constant threat of enemy attacks, and the stress of being far from home created a powder keg of emotions that sometimes exploded in unexpected ways. Sarah had always been tough. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she learned early how to handle herself in difficult situations. Her father, a decorated Vietnam veteran, had taught her self-defense from a young age, and her mother, a nurse who worked the night shift in the emergency room, had shown her the importance of staying calm under pressure. When Sarah enlisted in the Marines at 18, she quickly distinguished herself during boot camp at Parris Island. Her instructors noted her exceptional physical fitness, quick thinking under stress, and natural leadership abilities. After completing her initial training, Sarah was approached by a recruiter from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6. They were looking for qualified female personnel who could operate in environments where male operators would be too conspicuous. Sarah's bilingual skills, her ability to blend in with local populations, and her proven combat abilities made her an ideal candidate for the program. The training that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For 18 months, she underwent intensive instruction in advanced firearms, explosives, surveillance techniques, close-quarters combat, and psychological operations. She learned to speak Pashto and Dari fluently, studied Middle Eastern culture and customs, and practiced operating sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. The dropout rate for the program was over 90%, but Sarah not only survived, she excelled. Her current mission at Camp Leatherneck involved gathering intelligence on suspected Taliban infiltrators who were believed to have sympathizers among the local Afghan workers employed on the base. These workers, who performed various maintenance and support functions, had access to sensitive areas and could potentially provide valuable information to enemy forces about base operations, security procedures, and troop movements. Sarah's cover as a communications specialist gave her legitimate reasons to be in almost any area of the base. She could access communication centers, administrative buildings, supply depots, and living quarters without arousing suspicion. Over the past 3 months, she had identified several suspicious patterns of behavior among certain Afghan workers and had begun building detailed profiles of potential security threats. The work was slow and methodical, requiring infinite patience and attention to detail. Sarah had to maintain her cover identity at all times, which meant performing all the duties of a regular communications specialist while simultaneously conducting her covert intelligence gathering. She worked 12-hour shifts maintaining radio equipment, processing message traffic, and troubleshooting satellite communication problems, then spent her off-duty hours carefully observing and documenting the activities of suspected individuals. The isolation of her real mission was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her assignment. She couldn't discuss her work with anyone on the base, couldn't seek advice or support from fellow Marines, and had to constantly guard against saying or doing anything that might compromise her cover. Her only contact with her real chain of command was through encrypted communications sent during scheduled maintenance windows on the satellite systems. As Sarah walked from the gym toward the mess hall for breakfast, she reflected on a conversation she had overheard the previous day between 2 Afghan workers near the motor pool. They had been speaking in Dari, apparently unaware that anyone nearby could understand them. Their discussion had centered around shift schedules and which areas of the base would have reduced security coverage during certain time periods. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that enemy forces would find valuable for planning attacks. The mess hall was already crowded when Sarah arrived, with long lines of tired-looking service members waiting for coffee and whatever breakfast the cooks had managed to prepare. The facility was a large tent structure with rows of folding tables and plastic chairs, designed for function rather than comfort. The air conditioning unit struggled against the rising heat, and the constant hum of generators provided a background noise that everyone had learned to ignore. Sarah grabbed a tray and joined the line, scanning the room out of habit. She noticed the usual mix of personnel: Marines in their desert camouflage uniforms, soldiers in their ACUs, sailors in their working uniforms, and a scattering of civilian contractors and Afghan workers. The atmosphere was generally friendly, with different groups mixing freely and sharing complaints about the heat, the food, and their eagerness to return home. As she moved through the line, Sarah observed 3 soldiers from an army unit that had arrived at the base 2 weeks earlier. She had been keeping a casual eye on this particular group because their paperwork had some minor irregularities that had caught the attention of the base intelligence officer. Nothing serious enough to raise immediate red flags, but enough to warrant some discreet observation. The 3 soldiers were loud and aggressive, making crude jokes and comments about the Afghan workers serving food. Their behavior was drawing uncomfortable glances from other personnel, but nobody seemed willing to directly confront them. Sarah recognized the type: soldiers who viewed deployment as an opportunity to act out their frustrations and prejudices without consequences, especially toward local nationals who had no recourse for complaints. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the apparent leader of the group, was particularly obnoxious. He made disparaging comments about the quality of the food, complained loudly about having to eat meals prepared by these people, and generally conducted himself in a manner that reflected poorly on American forces. His 2 companions, Corporal James Patterson and Private First Class Tony Williams, seemed to feed off his negative energy and amplified his bad behavior. Sarah collected her breakfast and found a seat at a table near the back of the tent, positioning herself where she could observe the 3 soldiers without appearing to pay attention to them. She had developed the ability to eat while simultaneously conducting surveillance, a skill that had proven valuable during her months at the base. The conversation at the soldiers' table grew increasingly inappropriate, with Rodriguez making sexual comments about female personnel and sharing graphic stories about his experiences during previous deployments. His voice carried across the mess tent, causing several people to move to tables farther away. Sarah noticed that one of the Afghan food service workers, an elderly man named Hamid who had been employed on the base for over 2 years, was clearly uncomfortable with the soldiers' behavior but continued his duties without complaint. As Sarah finished her breakfast, she observed Rodriguez get up from his table and approach the food service line for seconds. Instead of waiting in line like everyone else, he pushed past several people and began making demands of the Afghan workers in broken English mixed with profanity. When Hamid politely explained the serving procedures, Rodriguez became belligerent and accused the man of being deliberately slow and uncooperative. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could see that other personnel in the mess hall were becoming uncomfortable but seemed reluctant to intervene. Military protocol generally discouraged confrontations between service members and local nationals, and most people preferred to avoid getting involved in situations that might result in paperwork or disciplinary action. Sarah faced a dilemma. Her mission required her to maintain a low profile and avoid drawing attention to herself. Getting involved in a confrontation would contradict her cover identity as a quiet communications specialist who minded her own business. However, she also couldn't stand by and watch the harassment of an innocent civilian worker who was simply trying to do his job. Her training had emphasized the importance of maintaining cover at all costs, but it had also instilled in her a strong sense of duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The elderly Afghan worker represented exactly the kind of local national whose cooperation was essential for successful military operations in the region. Allowing him to be mistreated by American soldiers would not only be morally wrong, but could also have negative consequences for the broader mission. As Rodriguez continued his verbal assault on Hamid, Sarah made her decision. She would intervene, but she would do so in a way that was consistent with her cover identity. A communications specialist might reasonably be expected to step in if she witnessed inappropriate behavior, especially if it involved the mistreatment of base personnel. Sarah stood up from her table and walked toward the food service area, her mind racing as she planned her approach. She needed to defuse the situation without appearing to be anything more than a concerned Marine who was uncomfortable with Rodriguez's behavior. She couldn't display any advanced combat skills or knowledge that would be inconsistent with her supposed role as a communications specialist. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant," Sarah said in a calm but firm voice as she approached Rodriguez. "I think there might be a misunderstanding here. Hamid is just following the standard serving procedures that apply to everyone." Rodriguez turned towards Sarah with an expression of surprise and annoyance. He was clearly not accustomed to being challenged, especially by someone of lower rank. His companions had also noticed the interaction and were moving closer, apparently ready to support their leader in whatever confrontation might develop. "Mind your own business, Corporal," Rodriguez replied, using Sarah's rank as displayed on her uniform. "This doesn't concern you." Sarah could feel the attention of everyone in the mess hall focusing on their interaction. She had hoped to resolve the situation quietly, but it was clear that Rodriguez was not going to back down easily. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, where a covert operative had to handle a confrontation while maintaining their cover identity. "It concerns all of us when base personnel are mistreated," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "We're all representing the United States here, and our behavior reflects on everyone." The tension in the room was palpable. Other service members had stopped eating and were watching the confrontation unfold. Some appeared ready to support Sarah if the situation escalated, while others seemed content to remain observers. The Afghan workers had stopped serving and were nervously watching the exchange, clearly concerned about what might happen next. Rodriguez's face flushed red with anger as he stepped closer to Sarah. "You think you can tell me how to behave, Corporal? I've got 3 years in grade and 2 combat tours under my belt. What have you got? Some technical training and a cushy job playing with radios?" Sarah remained calm, even as Rodriguez moved into her personal space in an obvious attempt to intimidate her. Her years of specialized training had taught her to read body language and assess threats, and she could see that Rodriguez was working himself up for a physical confrontation. His fists were clenched, his breathing was becoming more rapid, and his pupils were dilated with adrenaline. "Staff Sergeant, I'm just suggesting we all follow the same rules and treat base personnel with respect," Sarah said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing tension. "That's what good order and discipline looks like." Corporal Patterson and Private Williams had moved to flank Sarah, creating a triangle formation that would make it difficult for her to move away from the confrontation. This was clearly a practiced intimidation tactic that the 3 soldiers had used before. Sarah's training allowed her to quickly assess the tactical situation while appearing to remain focused on Rodriguez. Patterson was about 6 feet tall and heavily muscled, with tattoos covering both arms and a scar above his left eye that suggested previous combat experience. Williams was shorter but stockier, with the compact build of someone who spent considerable time in the gym. Both men had the same aggressive posture as their leader, and Sarah could see they were prepared to follow Rodriguez's lead regardless of the consequences. "Listen here, radio girl," Rodriguez said, using a deliberately dismissive tone. "Maybe you spend all day in air-conditioned rooms talking on the radio, but some of us do real work. Some of us have actually been in firefights and seen real combat. You don't get to lecture us about anything." The insult was designed to undermine Sarah's credibility and authority in front of the other service members watching the confrontation. Rodriguez was attempting to establish dominance by portraying Sarah as someone who had never faced danger and, therefore, had no right to challenge his behavior. It was a common tactic used by soldiers who relied on intimidation rather than actual leadership skills. Sarah could have easily corrected Rodriguez's assumptions about her combat experience. Her classified record included 3 separate direct action missions in Syria, 2 high-risk reconnaissance operations in Pakistan, and countless other operations that would have impressed even experienced special operations personnel. However, revealing any of that information would compromise her cover and potentially expose her real mission at the base. "I'm not trying to lecture anyone, Staff Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm just asking that we treat everyone on this base with basic respect. Hamid has been working here for 2 years without any problems. He's trying to do his job, and we should let him do it. Rodriguez laughed sarcastically and turned to address his companions. Can you believe this? Some communications geek thinks she's going to tell us how to act. Maybe she thinks her technical school training makes her better than real soldiers. The comment drew some uncomfortable murmurs from other personnel in the mess hall. Many of the Marines and soldiers present had considerable respect for communications specialists, who played a vital role in modern military operations. Rodriguez's dismissive attitude toward technical personnel reflected poorly on his understanding of how modern military units functioned. Sarah noticed that several senior non-commissioned officers had entered the mess hall and were observing the situation with obvious concern. Master Sergeant David Thompson from the base security force was standing near the entrance, and First Sergeant Maria Gonzalez from the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force had positioned herself where she could quickly intervene if necessary. Neither of them appeared ready to step in immediately, but their presence suggested that the confrontation was being monitored by the chain of command. The elderly Afghan worker, Hamid, had retreated behind the serving counter and was speaking quietly with other food service personnel. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as he tried to continue his duties. His reaction reminded her why she had decided to intervene in the first place, despite the risks to her cover mission. Maybe you need someone to explain how things work around here, Rodriguez continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. Maybe you need to understand that some of us have earned the right to be treated with respect, and we don't need to take advice from someone who's never been outside the wire. The accusation that Sarah had never left the base was particularly ironic, given that she had conducted numerous covert operations in Taliban-controlled territory over the past 3 months. Her missions had taken her deep into enemy territory, where she had gathered intelligence and conducted surveillance operations under conditions of extreme danger. However, these operations were so highly classified that even most of the base command structure was unaware of them. Sarah felt Rodriguez's finger poke her in the chest as he emphasized his point. The physical contact crossed a line that transformed the verbal confrontation into a potential assault. Under military regulations, unwanted physical contact could be considered assault, and Sarah would have been justified in defending herself. However, she also knew that any response on her part would escalate the situation and draw exactly the kind of attention she needed to avoid. "Staff Sergeant, please don't touch me," Sarah said clearly, making sure her words could be heard by everyone in the mess hall. "Let's keep this professional." Rodriguez's response was to poke her again, this time harder and with obvious malicious intent. "What are you going to do about it, radio girl? Going to call for backup on your little radio? Going to file a complaint with your supervisor?" Patterson and Williams laughed at their leader's joke, apparently enjoying the spectacle of what they perceived as a weak communications specialist being intimidated by their more experienced and aggressive friend. Their laughter encouraged Rodriguez to escalate further, and Sarah could see that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where violence would be unavoidable. The mess hall had become completely quiet except for the voices of the 3 soldiers. Other personnel had stopped eating and were watching with a mixture of concern and anticipation. Some appeared ready to intervene on Sarah's behalf, while others seemed content to watch the confrontation unfold. The Afghan workers had stopped serving entirely and were huddled together behind the food service counter, clearly frightened by the aggressive behavior of the American soldiers. Sarah's mind raced through her options. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, where a covert operative faced the choice between maintaining cover and defending themselves. She could continue to absorb the verbal and minor physical abuse while hoping that senior personnel would eventually intervene, or she could defend herself and risk exposing her true capabilities. The decision was made for her when Rodriguez suddenly grabbed her by the front of her uniform shirt and pulled her closer to his face. "Maybe you need a lesson in respect," he snarled, his breath reeking of coffee and tobacco. "Maybe you need to understand your place around here." The physical assault was now unmistakable, and Sarah knew she could no longer avoid responding. However, she also knew that she had to be very careful about how she defended herself. Any display of advanced combat skills would be inconsistent with her cover identity and could raise questions about her real background and training. "Let go of me right now," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying a note of authority that caused Rodriguez to hesitate slightly. You're assaulting me in front of witnesses, and you need to stop immediately. Instead of releasing her, Rodriguez tightened his grip on her shirt and drew back his free hand as if preparing to strike her. Maybe I'll show you what a real soldier can do, he threatened, his voice filled with barely controlled rage. Sarah could see that Patterson and Williams were moving closer, apparently ready to assist their leader if she attempted to resist. The three soldiers had clearly done this before and were confident that they could intimidate her into submission. They had no idea that they were attempting to assault someone who had been trained by some of the most elite special operations instructors in the world. As Rodriguez's fist began to move toward her face, Sarah's training took over. Without conscious thought, she grabbed his wrist with her left hand while simultaneously stepping to the side and driving her right elbow into his solar plexus. The strike was delivered with just enough force to cause Rodriguez to release her and double over in pain, but not enough to cause serious injury that would be inconsistent with basic self-defense training that any Marine might have received. Rodriguez stumbled backward, gasping for air and clutching his chest. "You bitch," he wheezed, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. "You're going to pay for that." Patterson immediately moved to grab Sarah from behind, but she had anticipated this response and was already moving. She stepped to the side and used Patterson's momentum against him, guiding him past her and into a nearby table. The maneuver looked like a lucky dodge to observers, but was actually a precisely executed technique designed to redirect an attacker's energy without revealing advanced training. Williams hesitated, apparently surprised by his companion's lack of success in subduing what they had assumed would be an easy target. His hesitation gave Sarah time to position herself defensively while maintaining the appearance that she was simply trying to avoid further confrontation rather than preparing for combat. "That's enough." Master Sergeant Thompson's voice boomed across the mess hall as he strode toward the confrontation. "Everyone step back and calm down right now." The arrival of senior leadership immediately changed the dynamics of the situation. Rodriguez straightened up and attempted to regain his composure, while Patterson climbed off the table where he had landed. Williams stepped away from Sarah and tried to blend back into the crowd of observers. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, explain yourself," Thompson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. "What's going on here?" Rodriguez pointed at Sarah accusingly. "That Marine attacked me for no reason, Master Sergeant. I was just trying to have a conversation with her, and she assaulted me." Thompson looked around the mess hall, taking in the scene and the faces of the witnesses. "Is that what happened here? Anyone else want to tell me what they saw?" Several Marines and soldiers began speaking at once, their accounts generally supporting Sarah's version of events. They described Rodriguez's aggressive behavior toward the Afghan worker, his escalating verbal confrontation with Sarah, and his physical assault that had precipitated her defensive response. Master Sergeant Thompson listened carefully to the various accounts from witnesses, his experienced eye taking in details that most people would miss. He had been a military policeman for 15 years before transferring to base security, and he had developed an ability to quickly assess situations and separate truth from fiction. The consistent testimony from multiple witnesses painted a clear picture of what had actually happened. "Corporal Martinez," Thompson said, addressing Sarah directly, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah shook her head. "No, Master Sergeant. I'm fine. I just defended myself when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez grabbed me and threatened to hit me." Thompson nodded and turned his attention back to Rodriguez, who was still rubbing his chest where Sarah's elbow had struck him. "Staff Sergeant, you're going to come with me to the security office. Your two friends here are also going to join us for a little conversation." Rodriguez's face showed a mixture of anger and concern as he realized that his version of events wasn't being accepted. "Master Sergeant, I'm telling you, she attacked me. I was just trying to have a conversation, and she went crazy." "We'll sort it all out at the security office," Thompson replied firmly. "Right now, I want you three to move toward the exit and wait for me outside. Don't say another word until we get there." As the three soldiers reluctantly headed toward the exit, Thompson turned to address the rest of the mess hall. "Everyone else, finish your breakfast and go about your business. There's nothing more to see here." First Sergeant Gonzalez approached Sarah as the crowd began to disperse. "Corporal Martinez, I want you to come with us to give your statement about what happened. You're not in trouble, but we need to document everything for the investigation." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was standard procedure for any incident involving potential assault charges. However, she was also concerned about the additional scrutiny that an investigation might bring to her activities on the base. Any detailed examination of her background or duties could potentially expose aspects of her cover identity that needed to remain secret. As they walked toward the security office, First Sergeant Gonzalez spoke quietly to Sarah. "I've been watching those 3 soldiers since they arrived at the base 2 weeks ago. They've been causing problems and making other personnel uncomfortable. What happened in the mess hall was probably inevitable." This information aligned with Sarah's own observations about the suspicious paperwork associated with Rodriguez's unit. She had been planning to investigate them further as part of her covert mission, but their aggressive behavior had forced a confrontation before she could gather more intelligence about their activities. The base security office was located in a concrete building near the main gate, designed to withstand mortar attacks and provide secure facilities for detention and investigation. Thompson led them into a conference room with a metal table and several plastic chairs, while Rodriguez and his companions were placed in separate holding rooms where they could be interviewed individually. "Corporal Martinez, I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning," Thompson said as he activated a digital recorder. "Take your time and include every detail you can remember." Sarah provided a careful account of the morning's events, being truthful about what had occurred while avoiding any details that might reveal her advanced training or her real mission on the base. She described Rodriguez's harassment of the Afghan worker, the escalating verbal confrontation, and the physical assault that had forced her to defend herself. "When Staff Sergeant Rodriguez grabbed your shirt, what exactly did you do?" Thompson asked, focusing on the moment when the situation had turned physical. "I grabbed his wrist to make him let go of me, and when he drew back his fist like he was going to hit me, I elbowed him in the stomach to get him away from me," Sarah explained. "It was just basic self-defense that we learned in boot camp." Thompson nodded approvingly. "That was appropriate use of force under the circumstances. You were being assaulted, and you defended yourself with minimal necessary force. The witnesses confirm your account of what happened." First Sergeant Gonzalez had been taking notes throughout Sarah's statement. "Corporal Martinez, have you had any previous interactions with these 3 soldiers? Any problems or conflicts before today?" Sarah shook her head. "No, First Sergeant. I've seen them around the base since they arrived, but today was the first time I've had any direct contact with them." This was technically true, although Sarah had been conducting discreet surveillance of the 3 soldiers as part of her intelligence-gathering mission. She had observed their activities and documented their behavior patterns, but had avoided any direct contact that might have alerted them to her interest in their activities. "What's your assessment of their general behavior on the base?" Thompson asked. "Have you noticed anything unusual or concerning about their conduct?" Sarah chose her words carefully, not wanting to reveal the extent of her observations. "They seem to have a generally disrespectful attitude toward base personnel, particularly the Afghan workers. Their behavior in the mess hall today wasn't completely out of character based on what I've observed." Meanwhile, in another room, Rodriguez was giving his version of events to a different investigator. His account painted Sarah as an aggressive troublemaker who had attacked him without provocation, while portraying himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault. However, his story was contradicted by the testimony of multiple witnesses, and his credibility was further undermined by his obvious hostility toward local nationals. The investigation continued for several hours, with statements taken from witnesses, base security footage reviewed, and background checks conducted on all parties involved. Sarah was relieved to find that the background check on her service record showed only her cover identity as a communications specialist, with no hint of her real assignment or specialized training. During a break in the questioning, Sarah overheard a conversation between Thompson and another security officer that caught her attention. They were discussing irregularities in the paperwork for Rodriguez's unit, including questions about their assigned duties and their access to certain areas of the base. This confirmed Sarah's earlier suspicions that there was something unusual about the 3 soldiers. Corporal Martinez, Thompson said when he returned to the conference room, I want you to know that based on our investigation, you acted appropriately in defending yourself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez will be facing charges for assault, and his two companions will likely face disciplinary action for their role in the incident. Sarah felt relieved, but also concerned about the continued attention that the incident might generate. Master Sergeant, will there be any follow-up investigation? I just want to get back to my duties and put this behind me. Thompson smiled reassuringly. The investigation is essentially complete. We have clear evidence of what happened, and the witnesses all support your account. You should be able to return to your normal duties immediately. However, as Sarah left the security office, she noticed that she was being observed by Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the base intelligence officer. Harrison was someone she had been carefully avoiding during her time at the base, since his background in counterintelligence made him particularly skilled at detecting individuals who might not be what they appeared to be. Harrison approached her as she walked back toward the communications center. Corporal Martinez, I was wondering if I could have a word with you about this morning's incident. Sarah felt a chill of concern, but maintained her composure. Of course, sir. What can I help you with? Harrison gestured toward a nearby building. Let's step into my office for a few minutes. I have some questions about the soldiers who were involved in the incident. As they walked, Harrison engaged in casual conversation about Sarah's duties and her time at the base. His questions seemed innocent enough, but Sarah recognized the interrogation techniques he was using to gather information while appearing to make small talk. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of subtle questioning from skilled intelligence professionals. Harrison's office was a small, windowless room filled with filing cabinets, computers, and communications equipment. Maps of the local area covered the walls, marked with colored pins indicating various intelligence assessments and threat levels. Sarah noticed several documents on his desk that appeared to relate to the three soldiers who had confronted her. Corporal Martinez, I've been reviewing the files on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his unit, Harrison said as he settled behind his desk. There are some irregularities in their paperwork that have caught my attention. I was wondering if you might have observed anything unusual about their activities on the base. Sarah realized that Harrison's interest in the three soldiers might actually align with her own covert mission. The irregularities he mentioned could be related to the security concerns that had prompted her assignment to the base in the first place. However, she also had to be extremely careful not to reveal that she had been conducting her own investigation. I haven't really noticed anything specific, sir, Sarah replied carefully. Today was the first time I've had any direct interaction with them, but their behavior toward the Afghan workers seemed inappropriate. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. The reason I'm asking is that we've had some concerns about potential security breaches involving local nationals employed on the base. We're trying to determine whether certain personnel might be involved in inappropriate contacts with these workers. This was exactly the type of intelligence that Sarah had been gathering during her covert mission. She had identified several suspicious patterns of interaction between certain American personnel and Afghan workers, and Rodriguez's unit had been among those flagged for further investigation. However, she couldn't reveal this information without exposing her real identity and mission. I understand the concern, sir, Sarah said. If I notice anything unusual in the future, I'll certainly report it through proper channels. Harrison studied her face carefully, his trained eyes looking for any signs of deception or hidden knowledge. Corporal Martinez, your service record shows excellent performance in communications and technical fields. Have you ever considered applying for intelligence work? We're always looking for qualified personnel with your background. The offer was both flattering and dangerous. If Sarah showed too much interest, it might raise questions about her real background. If she showed too little interest, it might seem suspicious for someone with her apparent qualifications. She needed to strike a balance that would seem natural for a communications specialist. I've thought about it, sir, but I'm really focused on my current duties right now, Sarah replied. Maybe in the future when I have more experience. Harrison smiled and handed her a business card. Well, if you ever change your mind, please feel free to contact me. In the meantime, I want you to know that if you observe anything unusual about the activities of Rodriguez or his associates, I would very much like to hear about it." As Sarah left Harrison's office, she realized that the morning's incident had created both opportunities and risks for her mission. The confrontation had given her legitimate reasons to pay attention to Rodriguez and his companions, but it had also brought her to the attention of the base intelligence officer. She would need to be even more careful in her future operations to avoid arousing further suspicion. 3 days after the mess hall incident, Sarah was conducting routine maintenance on communications equipment when she received an encrypted message that would change everything. The message, embedded within routine technical updates from Naval Communications Command, contained instructions for an emergency extraction protocol. Her handlers had been monitoring the situation at Camp Leatherneck and had determined that her cover might be compromised. The message was brief but alarming: "Package may be exposed. Prepare for immediate extraction. Maintain cover until further notice. Report any unusual surveillance or questioning." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. Someone had discovered her true identity, or at least suspected that she wasn't the simple communications specialist she pretended to be. The timing, coming so soon after her confrontation with Rodriguez and her meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, suggested that one of these events had triggered the security concern. Over the next 24 hours, Sarah noticed increased attention from base security personnel. She was being watched, but in a subtle way that might have escaped the notice of someone without her specialized training. Guards took longer looks at her identification when she entered secure areas. Colleagues seemed to ask more questions about her duties and her background. The pattern was unmistakable to someone trained in counterintelligence techniques. The situation became more urgent when Sarah learned that Rodriguez and his 2 companions had been released from detention pending a formal disciplinary hearing. Despite the clear evidence of their misconduct, their unit commander had intervened and arranged for their release on their own recognizance. This development suggested that Rodriguez's group had more influence and protection than a simple army support unit should possess. That evening, as Sarah was leaving the communications center after her shift, she was approached by Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb from Rodriguez's unit. Webb was someone she had not encountered before, but her intelligence files indicated that he was Rodriguez's immediate supervisor and had arrived at the base with the same suspicious paperwork irregularities. "Corporal Martinez," Webb said with a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I was hoping I could buy you a coffee and apologize for the behavior of my soldiers the other day. What happened in the mess hall was completely unacceptable." Sarah immediately recognized this as a probing operation designed to gather information about her while appearing to offer an apology. "That's not necessary, Sergeant. The matter has been handled through proper channels." Webb persisted, falling into step beside her as she walked toward her living quarters. "I insist. My soldiers acted inappropriately, and, as their supervisor, I feel responsible. The least I can do is offer a proper apology and maybe learn a bit about the Marine they offended." The request was phrased politely, but Sarah could hear the undertone of command authority. Webb was not really asking for her time, he was demanding it in a way that would be difficult to refuse without appearing rude or suspicious. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of social engineering attempt. "I appreciate the gesture, Sergeant, but I really need to get some rest," Sarah replied, trying to end the conversation without seeming uncooperative. "Maybe some other time." Webb's expression shifted slightly, revealing a hint of the calculation behind his friendly facade. "Actually, Corporal, I think it would be in your best interest to have that conversation. There are some things about recent events that you might find interesting." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Webb was suggesting that he possessed information that could be problematic for Sarah, and that cooperation would be in her best interest. This confirmed her suspicion that Rodriguez's group was more than they appeared to be, and that they might have discovered something about her real identity. Sarah made a quick decision. Rather than continuing to avoid the confrontation, she would engage with Webb and try to determine what he knew. "All right, Sergeant. Let's have that coffee." They walked to a small recreational facility that served coffee and snacks to off-duty personnel. The building was relatively quiet at this time of evening, with only a few people reading or playing cards at scattered tables. Webb selected a corner table that would allow them to speak privately while still appearing to have a casual conversation. Corporal Martinez, Webb began once they were seated with their coffee, my research into recent events has revealed some interesting information about you. Your service record is impressive, but it also raises some questions. Sarah maintained her composure while her mind analyzed the possible implications of Webb's statement. I'm not sure what you mean, Sergeant. My service record is straightforward communications training and assignments. Webb smiled in a way that suggested he knew more than he was revealing. That's true, as far as it goes. But there are some gaps in your timeline that are unusual for someone with your supposed background. Periods where your location and duties aren't clearly documented. This was extremely troubling. Sarah's cover identity had been carefully constructed by experts in creating false documentation, and it should have been able to withstand casual scrutiny. If Webb had identified discrepancies, it suggested either that he had access to sophisticated intelligence resources or that there had been problems with her cover story. I'm not sure what gaps you're referring to, Sarah replied carefully. I've been assigned to communications duties throughout my Marine career. Webb leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation couldn't be overheard. Let me be more specific, Corporal. There are 18 months in your service record where your location is listed as training assignments without any details about where that training took place or what specific skills you learned. Sarah's blood ran cold. Webb had identified the exact period when she had undergone her special operations training with Naval Special Warfare. The cover story for that period was supposed to indicate advanced communications training at various technical schools, but apparently someone had found inconsistencies in the documentation. I attended several different technical schools during that period, Sarah said, sticking to her cover story. Communications technology changes rapidly, and the Marine Corps invests heavily in keeping personnel current with new systems. Webb nodded as if accepting her explanation, but his expression suggested that he wasn't convinced. Of course. The thing is, I have contacts in the communications training community, and when I made some inquiries about your supposed attendance at these schools, the records were surprisingly difficult to verify. This revelation confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Webb wasn't just a curious supervisor looking into the background of someone who had defeated his soldiers. He was conducting a sophisticated investigation using intelligence resources that shouldn't have been available to a regular Army unit. His group was definitely not what they claimed to be. Sergeant Webb, Sarah said, deciding to go on the offensive, I'm curious about why you're conducting background investigations on Marine personnel. That seems outside the normal scope of duties for an Army support unit. Webb's smile faltered slightly, suggesting that Sarah's question had caught him off guard. I'm just trying to understand the person who assaulted my soldiers. When someone displays unusual combat skills, it naturally raises questions about their background and training. The reference to unusual combat skills confirmed that Webb had analyzed her defensive actions in the mess hall and recognized that they were inconsistent with basic self-defense training. Her carefully controlled response to Rodriguez's assault had been more sophisticated than it should have been for someone with her supposed background. I used basic self-defense techniques that any Marine learns in boot camp, Sarah insisted. There was nothing unusual about defending myself when I was being assaulted. Webb pulled out a tablet computer and showed Sarah a video recording. This is security footage from the mess hall incident. I've had it analyzed by someone with expertise in martial arts and combat techniques. According to his assessment, your response showed training that goes well beyond basic self-defense. Sarah watched the video with growing concern. The footage clearly showed her defensive actions, and she could see how an expert analysis might identify techniques that were more advanced than they should have been. Her training had emphasized the importance of using minimal necessary force, but apparently she had still revealed more capability than was consistent with her cover. I'm not sure what your expert thinks he sees, Sarah said, but I simply defended myself when I was attacked. If you have concerns about the incident, you should discuss them with base security or my chain of command. Webb turned off the tablet and leaned back in his chair. Actually, Corporal, I think we can help each other. My unit is conducting some activities that require personnel with specialized skills. Someone with your apparent capabilities might find our work very interesting and very profitable. Sarah realized that Webb was attempting to recruit her, apparently believing that she was some kind of covert operative who might be willing to work with his group. This suggested that his unit was engaged in activities that were outside normal military channels, possibly including the security breaches that Sarah had been sent to investigate. What kind of activities? Sarah asked, hoping to gather intelligence about Webb's real mission. Webb looked around carefully before responding. Let's just say that there are opportunities in this theater of operations for people who understand how to operate outside normal channels. The local economy creates certain opportunities that aren't available through official military contracts. The reference to local economy and unofficial opportunities strongly suggested that Webb's group was involved in illegal activities, possibly including smuggling, black market trading, or other forms of corruption that could compromise base security. This aligned with the intelligence concerns that had prompted Sarah's original mission. That sounds interesting, but I'm not sure I understand what you're proposing, Sarah said, encouraging Webb to provide more specific information. Webb studied her face carefully, apparently trying to assess whether she was genuinely interested or whether she might be gathering information for base security. Let me put it this way, Corporal. There are ways to make a deployment more profitable than just collecting military pay. People with the right skills and the right attitude can do very well for themselves. Before Sarah could respond, her conversation with Webb was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and 2 military police officers. Harrison's expression was grim as he approached their table, and Sarah realized that the situation was about to become much more complicated. Sergeant Webb, Corporal Martinez, Harrison said formally, I need both of you to come with me for questioning regarding a security matter. As they were escorted from the recreational facility, Sarah caught Webb's eye and saw a mixture of anger and calculation in his expression. He apparently believed that she had somehow arranged for Harrison's intervention, possibly as part of a setup to gather evidence against his group. The truth was much more complex. Sarah realized that multiple investigations had been running simultaneously, and the morning's mess hall incident had created a convergence that was bringing everything into the open. Her covert mission to investigate security breaches had intersected with whatever operation Webb's group was conducting, and the confrontation with Rodriguez had been the catalyst that exposed the entire situation. As they were separated for individual questioning, Sarah received one final encrypted message on her secure communications device. The message was simple but definitive, cover blown. Extraction authorized. Proceed to emergency protocols. Sarah understood that her months of careful intelligence gathering were about to culminate in a way she had never expected. The confrontation in the mess hall, which had seemed like a dangerous complication to her mission, had actually provided the key to unraveling a security threat that was much larger and more dangerous than anyone had realized. The 3 soldiers who had assaulted her in the mess hall were not just troublemakers with attitude problems. They were part of a sophisticated operation that had infiltrated the base and was using their positions to conduct illegal activities that could compromise the security of American forces throughout the region. Her defensive actions that morning had set in motion a chain of events that would expose the entire conspiracy and protect the lives of thousands of military personnel. As Sarah was led toward what would be her final debrief before extraction, she reflected on the irony that her most important mission accomplishment had come not through careful surveillance and intelligence gathering, but through a moment when she had simply stood up for an elderly Afghan worker who was being mistreated by American soldiers. Sometimes the most significant victories came from the simplest acts of doing what was right.